Well, we have been going through a series on the sovereignty of God. And in our previous message, we asked the question, is God really in control? I mean, really, is God in control of everything that's happening in the world today, especially when it seems like you watch the world and it's just crumbling apart right before our eyes? Is God the sovereign king over his universe, or is chance, is luck king of this universe? And we saw in the last sermon that the Bible gives us a clear definition of the sovereignty of God. We said that God has omnipotent power and complete freedom to do whatever he wants to do. That is the sovereignty of God. God has power, he has authority, and he can do whatever it is that he wants to do. And biblically, we answer that question by looking at three specific details about his sovereignty from Ephesians 1:11. Look there with me. Paul writes, also, we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. And we said that God's sovereignty has a purpose, and his purpose is his glory. This is why everything exists. This is why everything has been created. This is why you and I have been redeemed. It's for the glory of God. And we said that God's sovereignty has power. Here, Paul says God is the one who works all things after the counsel of his will. And therefore, God controls every atom that he has created. That there is not a solitary atom spinning in our universe apart from the sovereign control of God. And third, we said that God has his providential plan in that last phrase, the counsel of his will, the deliberation that God took before he formulated a final decision. And that deliberating of his will was done with perfect wisdom, perfect righteousness, perfect goodness, and love. This morning, we want to explore the relationship between the sovereignty of God and human suffering. This has perplexed theologians and philosophers and people throughout the centuries. If God really is in control, why does he allow so much suffering in our world today? And specifically, I want to focus our time and attention this morning on what I would call innocent suffering or unexpected suffering. We all know that it's one thing for us to experience suffering when we've done something wrong. We can trace the reasons for whatever trouble or trial in our life back to some specific sin. We see the loving discipline of God. We see his chastisement to formulate holiness in us. And that's easy because we see a clear cause and effect with our suffering. I'm suffering, and the specific cause are these sins, these unrepentant sins in my life that I've refused to give up. And so God, in his love and his care for me as a child, comes and he administers a loving spanking through this trial, and that grabs my attention, and then I'm more holy as a result of that difficulty. That's easier to handle because we see clearly the reason behind the suffering. But what about suffering? What about unexpected suffering that just seems to come out of nowhere, that's not connected to any specific sin in your life? And what about the kind of suffering that's not just everyday mundane suffering, but the kind that is so extreme and so persevering that it causes you to question God? It's happened to some of you already. It has. In the young life of this church, we have faced a number and series of heartbreaking trials. Children with unexpected cancer. The loss of grown children, having to bury one of your own children. One day you may feel a lump on your body, go to the doctor, and all of a sudden, to your surprise, you have cancer. Or one day, this house that you're building of financial wealth just comes crashing down and you're left with nothing. And when calamity strikes, often we struggle and we ask God over and over again, God, why? Why are you doing this? Why have you done this? As a pastor, one of the great responsibilities that I feel for you as a church, for myself, for my family, is to prepare my brothers and sisters for that day of suffering. I think I would be a lousy pastor if all we talked about was kind of the blessings and all the good stuff about Christianity, and yet we avoided the hard topics like suffering, and we kind of avoided preparing your heart for that day. And that's our prayer. That's my prayer for my life. That's my prayer for your life, that when that day of calamity comes, and if you've lived long enough, it's already come, that when that day happens in your life, that we wouldn't run from God, no, but that we would run to God, that we would trust in God no matter how deep, no matter how long the duration that trial may last. I believe this is why in our Bibles we have the book of Job, the book of Job. Because here we have a man of righteous character, a blameless man named Job, and we see that his calamity has no connection with his godly character. And the book of Job helps to answer questions like, how do we make sense of innocent suffering? What is God doing when he drops a trial, pain into the lives of one of his children, and there's no connection whatsoever to some specific sin in the heart of that child? And what is our response to be like? So open your Bibles with me to the book of Job, and what I want to do is three things this morning. First, I want us to see Job's suffering from his human, limited perspective. Second, I want us to see the sufferings of Job from God's perspective, his infinite perspective. And then third, I want us to look at some key points of application. Look with me at point number 1, the painful sufferings of Job. It starts out in verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was, note, blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Job was a man of the highest moral caliber. He was a man who did what was right before God despite what other people saw in his life. He was blameless. He was upright. He did not fear men. He feared God. He lived in this consistent reverence and respect for God. And you wonder, why is this guy being chosen to suffer? The least likely person to be the object of God's suffering, and yet when you see the story unfold, he is the most qualified. Look at verse 2. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. He not only was blessed in his walk with God, but he was blessed physically. He was a wealthy man, large family, huge number of possessions, known as the greatest man of all the men of the East. Look at verse 4. Sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite the 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Job loved his family, loved his kids. And he was so concerned about their relationship with God. And he wanted to honor God as a family. And he cares for their lives. And he makes these sacrifices just to make sure that had they sinned at these parties, these birthday celebrations, that these sacrifices would cover them. Jump down to verse 13. Note what happens. One day, all of this is happening. Okay, think about this. First of all, his oxen, his donkeys, and his servants are all killed. His servants are murdered. His oxen and donkeys are stolen from him. And then right after that, we see the destruction of his sheep and the death of his servants. And then right after that, we see more theft, camels being stolen, and more servants being murdered. And so, in a matter of a few hours, Job has lost everything in terms of his material possessions. He's lost all of his wealth. Wealth back then was not only measured by money, but also by these animals here. And Job has lost it all. But I don't think that was the hardest part. Because the last servant comes and tells him in verses 18 and 19 that all of your offspring are dead. All your sons, all your daughters, any grandchildren, they're all gone. Imagine if that were you. One day you're minding your own business and phone call after phone call, visitor after visitor is telling you one by one, you've lost everything. You got nothing left. How does Job respond? How does he respond to this incredible series of innocent sufferings? Well, we see his response in verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. That's remarkable. Upon hearing the loss of everything precious to him, especially his family, Job gets down on the ground and he just worships God. You see, Job's theology of the sovereignty of God was foundation upon which he stood in the midst of his trial. He realized, note, that it was from God's hand of goodness that God gave. God is the one who gave him the children. God is the one who gave him all of those possessions. But he also recognized it's from the same hand of God's sovereignty that God has the right to take. He not only has the right to give whatever he pleases, but God also has the power and the authority to take life, to take blessing. And instead of cursing God, he got down on his knees and he just had a little worship service there as he's praising God and he's adoring the one who gave and who took away. In these initial days, I believe Job lived out 2 Corinthians 6:10, where Paul says, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. Note what happens next. Job 2, verse 7. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. These boils are probably a form of smallpox, painful sores all over his body, head to toe. They're starting to itch, so he takes a piece of pottery and he's just scraping the sores, probably bleeding all over. These sores have literally changed his complexion. It's disfigured his appearance. His friends can't even recognize him. And note in verse 9, his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. How tempting that would be. That after this series of sovereign sufferings from the hand of God, Job, fully aware that this wasn't chance, this wasn't luck. No, these things were sovereignly placed in his life from God. How tempting it would be for Job to raise his fist in anger, in pain, and to curse God and to walk away. His wife has had enough. She's buckled. Why? Because It's one thing for Job to lose his possessions. It's another thing for Job to lose his posterity. But now, for him to lose his life would virtually leave her with nothing, no means of survival. And so she calls on Job, curse God and die. But Job's faith stood firm, even though his wives had failed. He says, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And we could say, in parentheses, and from God, not accept adversity? You see, Job's theology is kicking in. It's helping him to remain under the trial, to be steadfast in faith. In what way? He knew God was the one who sovereignly allowed these trials into his life. And if God's goodness is accepted by his children, if we're greedy and saying, yes, Lord, give me blessing, give me blessing, give me blessing, Job's theology said, if we accept good from God, should we not also accept adversity? I think many of us, we love the good. We love the blessing. We're greedy for the blessings of God. Yes, Lord, give me more. We love this. It's so pleasing. It's so satisfying. But our doctrine of sovereignty ends when from the same hand, God starts to dole out adversity and trial and suffering. So how do we make sense of all of this? Look at point number 2, the sovereign purpose of God. Without God divulging what's really happening behind the scenes of this earthly drama, we would never know what God's purposes are in giving Job this kind of suffering. It must be understood from God's perspective. People through the ages have tried to figure this out. George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, makes a mockery of God from the book of Job. He concludes that Job wants an answer for his suffering, and all God can come up with is to brag about making snowflakes and crocodiles. Rabbi Harold Kushner, in his book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, comes to this conclusion. He says, God wants the righteous to live peaceful, happy lives, but sometimes even he can't bring that about. It is too difficult even for God to keep cruelty and chaos from claiming their innocent victims. When we try to unlock the meaning and the reason behind the book of Job, it's like trying to unlock a door with the wrong key. No matter how hard we try with that key, no matter how hard we try to force that lock to open, it will never open. And so what is the key to understanding the innocent sufferings of Job? And look in your Bibles with me. I don't have this on the screen, but it would help if you just follow along in your own Bibles. Look with me at Job 1, 6-12. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." And look at verse 11. "But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Look at the next section, chapter 2, verses 1-6. Again, there was a day when the sons of God, and this is after Job's initial calamity. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves for the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. And note Satan's response: skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. That's the key to understanding the book of Job. What's going on in this discussion that's taking place between God and Satan that is totally unbeknownst to Job? Satan makes the claim, and this is so significant, beloved. He says the only reason why your people are loyal to you, the only reason why they love you, the only reason why they worship you, the only reason why they come to church and do things that are pleasing to you, here's their greatest motivation. It's because you just bless them. You just give them stuff. And that's what they really love. You see, God, Satan is saying, they don't love you. They don't care about you. They care less about a relationship with you. Here's what they really care about. It's just all the blessings that you give. And so God, take away Job's blessings. Hurt him physically. And guess what? He will turn his back on you and curse you. That's what's going to happen. And this is the very reason behind the sufferings of Job. God is seeking to put on display. This is what he wants. That he is worthy to be loved and worshiped despite the suffering he gives to his people. That's the key to the book of Job. Satan's claim before God is contrary. You give health, wealth, prosperity, take it all away, and your people won't follow you. They won't want to have anything to do with you. In other words, Satan claims that Job only loves God for what he gives, not for who he is. And yet God demonstrates throughout this book that the primary reason why God's people love God and remain loyal to God is not because of his gifts, but because he is a glorious, worthy God to be praised. You see, God's people remain loyal to God because in and of himself, okay, think about that. In and of himself, who God is, this great, gracious, glorious God, that's enough for his people to stick with him through any suffering, any trial. And beloved, that's the very truth that transforms our hearts. It transforms our perspectives when we face innocent suffering. The trial God has placed in your life has become an opportunity for you to glorify God. How? By remaining steadfastly loyal to God. To keep believing in God and his word. And think about it. God has chosen you and me, his people, to shut Satan up. John Piper writes, God chooses to get an open victory over Satan for his own glory. A test will show that in the heart of Job, God himself is more highly esteemed than any possession or any family member. And I think one of the ways God accomplishes this aim to bring glory to himself is by dropping trials and suffering into our lives, trials that are totally unexpected and totally unexplained. And for those who truly love God, to those who are truly loyal to God more than anyone or anything else, that's what grips their heart, is to see God glorified and honored despite all the pain that God has ordained in their life. They remain loyal to God no matter what. And I know some of you here this morning, you're right there on that razor's edge, this precipice. This trial in your life has just kind of brought you to this point. And I know some of you are thinking, it's not worth it. Following God is not worth it. It's just too costly. It sounds so much easier just to say, forget you, God. I'm tired of this pain. I'm tired of the struggle. I don't need you. I will control my own life. And so it boils down to this fundamental question, beloved. Is God in and of himself? Not in what he gives. Not in the blessings that he bestows on you. But he himself, is he himself worthy of your greatest devotion and deepest praise? That's what you have to wrestle with. Will you stay close to God? Will you keep trusting God despite the trials he's given to you? So let me close with a few practical applications. And I trust these will be helpful as we sort through just the practical theology of the sovereignty of God and human suffering. The first is this: there is such a thing as innocent suffering. Innocent suffering. The consistent references to Job's blameless character at the start of the book, especially from God's perspective, teach us that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. What is that? It's suffering that occurs and it's not directly connected to a specific sin in your life. Now we know generally that all suffering is connected to the sin of Adam. Adam's sin brought sin and suffering and disease and death into human history. But the suffering Job and many others have faced was not directly linked to a specific sin that he had committed. D.A. Carson writes this: although the Bible insists that all sinners will eventually suffer, it does not insist that each instance of suffering is retribution for sin. So as you make sense of your suffering, I think this would be helpful that you don't just automatically place it in the category of some cause and effect in your life. Well, I did this 5 years ago. I have so many regrets. I'm so ashamed of it. And that's surely the reason why this trial is in my life today. That may not be the case. When Jesus and the disciples encountered a man who was blind from birth, Jewish minds had no category for that. The only place they could put this blindness in this man was in the category, this guy sinned or his parents sinned, and that's why he's been afflicted with blindness all his life. That was the only category. And Jesus answered in John 9:3, he says, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. That's the purpose of all innocent suffering. It's so that the glory of God might be put on display through the suffering that he has ordained. And beloved, we must be very careful. And not only for the one going through the suffering, but we as counselors coming alongside of those who are suffering, that we don't put their suffering automatically in the category, well, God must be disciplining you. God must be punishing you. You got something you're hiding. Come on, come clean, and God will remove the suffering. That's exactly what Job's friends did. their conclusion, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, was what? Job, you've sinned against God. You're so stubborn. You're so proud. You're not willing to admit your fault. And so just come clean because that's the reason why you've suffered. That was their conclusion. Job 4, 7 and 8, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. That was the only category Job's friends had. Cause, effect. This is because you have some secret sin, come clean, and your suffering will be explained. Because of this narrow and wrong view of God, Job calls these friends worthless physicians, miserable comforters. I think we can do that when we see people suffering around us. We can look at their suffering and we can quickly place that suffering into this category. Well, we think, oh, they must have done something wrong. They're hiding something. This is why God's allowed all of this. You know what that does to our hearts as brothers and sisters? It just kills compassion. It kills empathy. It kills patience. And furthermore, it can lead that person to great despair and great discouragement when they attach some regret or some guilt to that innocent suffering. If only I had, and fill in the blank. Why didn't I just, or it's because I did this in the past. Worrying about the past will not change what God has allowed into our lives. So there is such a thing called innocent suffering. Here's the second application. This is hard. God does not owe us an explanation. God does not owe us an explanation. Throughout the entire book of Job, God never explains to Job why he allowed him to suffer so much. He's never privy to this conversation, this cosmic conversation that took place between the Lord and Satan. And God never divulges the information about that conversation. Even at the end of the book, God never gives Job the reason for his suffering. In fact, the majority of the book, chapters 3 to 31, narrates the wrestling of Job and his three friends as they're trying to unlock the reason. That's what they're getting at. Why? Job, why are you suffering? Job's asking, why am I suffering? And Job finally comes to this conclusion. He says, since there isn't a specific sin in my heart directly connected to the suffering, this is the only thing that he can conclude. God, you are arbitrarily mean. God, you just kind of whimsically throw out trial and trouble, and there's no reason for that, and therefore, you're kind of unjust, God. You're not really a righteous God, not the way that I thought you were, because there's no explanation for why you allowed this suffering. Look what he says, Job 13:23. How many are my iniquities and sins? Make known to me my rebellion and my sin. Why do you, God, why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? See where this has taken Job? Was God Job's enemy? Not at all. Was God just arbitrarily hurting Job for no reason at all, just to be a powerful God, to throw around his weight as the sovereign God? No. God was Job's loving heavenly Father. And the reason why he allowed Job to suffer was because of his love for Job, not because of his hatred of Job. Listen to Lamentations 3, 32 and 33. And this is so important, beloved. It says, if God causes grief, then he will have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. If God sovereignly ordains affliction in your life, he will show you compassion, even though he was the one who sovereignly ordained your calamity. And then look at the next part, verse 33. For God does not afflict willingly. What is that? He doesn't do it from the heart. It's not in God's heart to just in a mean-spirited way to send affliction into our lives. But when God sends affliction, it's a painful sending that's taking place in his heart, and it's surrounded by compassion and loving kindness. You see, I think as soon as we lose sight of the fact that, God, this is happening, and you love me. As soon as we lose sight of that and we detach the love of God from the suffering, we lose our grip on faith. So easy to go down this slippery slope where we kind of careen into this abyss of unbelief and darkness, and our thoughts take us to dark places. Why? Because we've lost sight of the fact, wait a minute. It's not happening because you're angry. It's not happening because you're trying to curse me. No, this is happening because, God, you actually love me. That's why it's happening. John Owen, the great Puritan, wrote, so much as we see the love of God, so much shall we delight in him and no more. Every other discovery of God without this will but make the soul fly from God. You cannot trust God if in your mind you have doubts about whether or not he is really for you. If you're thinking, God, you're against me. God, you've condemned me. Nearly impossible for you to go to him and say, oh, I trust you too. And although Job does not initially blame God in chapters 1 and 2, as the trial lingers, note what happens. Job 31:35. He points his finger at God. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me in the indictment which my adversary has written. See what's happened? Job is now pointing his finger at God and saying, I demand a hearing from you. I demand you to listen to my pleas for justice. So God, you need to listen to me because I've got something to say. And he's demanding the reason, the explanation. God, why have you allowed this suffering into my life? And beloved, please hear this so carefully and so cautiously. This is where we must be so careful. That as the trial continues and as the pain lingers, it can be very tempting to start blaming God for the pain. No answers, no reasons, no explanations. All we face is just every day pain, more trial, more suffering, not going away. And maybe it's a chronic illness, a physical disability, or the unexpected loss of a loved one, and that pain never goes away. Or maybe it's just a hard marriage, and you're seeing yourself on this sinking ship, and yet you vowed to God sickness and health till death do us part. And you're like, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it? Or perhaps you're just faced with a painful life all throughout your life. You've just faced disappointment after disappointment. Everything in your life just seems to be hard. You look at other people, it's easy. But you look at your life and it's like, God, why is everything so hard for me? And so here's the third point. Lamenting is okay. Blaming God is not. It's okay to express sorrow, absolutely. In Job 3, Job offers up a lament to God. He vents his despair, his loss of hope. 3:11, he says, why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? He's basically saying, why wasn't I just a stillborn? There are Psalms of lament where the psalmist pours out his heart to God in great anguish and sorrow. Our memory verse this last week was one of them, Psalm 42, 3 and 5. My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me? And I think that's fine. Instead of putting on some fake pious mask saying, oh, everything's okay, I'm doing great. Here is Job in just realness and rawness. And we see that in the Psalms, that when God afflicts your life with trial and suffering, it's fine to lament. Yes, weep. Be filled with sorrow. That's okay. But there is a place that we cannot go in our suffering. And here it is. We do not have the right to blame God for what he has done. God finally gives Job an audience, but note what God says. Job 40, verse 8. God is speaking directly to Job. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Job is thinking, fully justified to bring accusations against God because what he's done is unjust. It's not fair. And here God lets Job know, and he lets all of us know as well, we are never justified to blame God or to curse him for what he allows into our lives. And that's whether he gives an explanation for the suffering or whether God chooses to withhold the explanation for our suffering. We do not have a right to blame God for what he has done. You see, we can get so caught up in trying to figure out why, that we actually lose sight of what. We're so consumed with the reason for our suffering, and we fail to see, listen, if God gave you the reason for your suffering, that's not the answer to your suffering. That is not the answer. What is the answer? The answer is to trust God. That is the answer for all human suffering. Why? Because God does not owe us an explanation for our sufferings. He simply calls us to trust him. And I think the reason why is because he wants us to teach us the nature of a faith that is wholly abandoned to God. You see, trust that has all of these strings attached, if you think about it, it's not really trust. Well, God, I'll trust you. I'll believe in you if you take the trial away. I'll trust you if you give me an answer. I'll trust you if you change my spouse. I'll trust you if my financial portfolio gets healthier over this next month. That's when I'll trust you. And God simply calls us without explanation. And he simply throws out this question, will you just trust me? Will you trust me, period? Not will you trust me, comma, and then fill in the blank for why you'll trust him. God is just saying, will you trust me? Am I trustworthy to handle all the minute, specific details of your life? Is God trustworthy for you? Here's the fourth and final application. God can be trusted and loved for who he is. Job teaches us that God can be trusted and loved for who he is, not merely for what he has given. And this goes back to Satan's attack on God. The only reason why Christians follow you, God, he could probably say the same thing. The only reason why Christians follow you today in the world is because you just give them stuff that they want. You know, you give them health, wealth, prosperity, family, kids, homes, cars, right? We live in this peaceful country, lots of freedoms. But if you take away their possessions, if you take away the people that really matter, if you take away their prosperity, then guess what, God? They're going to just turn their backs on you. And this is where Job, in Job 121, in the initial stages of his suffering, and I reiterate it again, he said, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Let's note here, Job is not simply stating something that God did. He's not simply stating, well, God blessed me and now God has taken away some things from me. No, what Job is doing is he is saying, this is God's prerogative. This is the sovereign power and right of this great God. This is his authority. This is the privilege that God has for all humanity. God has the right to give life, to give blessing, and God has the right to take life and to take blessings away. And if you are taking big gulps of this 21st century cultural air, you know what's going to happen? You will believe the exact opposite. You will believe that you have an inalienable right to what? To comfort, to ease, to pleasure. That's your inalienable right living here in the prosperous West of the 21st century. That's what worldliness does to the human soul. And therefore, many people, even in the church, don't believe that when calamity strikes their lives, God, you have no business doing what you're doing in my life. You don't have that right. How dare you, God, do this and this and this to me? How dare you bring pain into my life and disrupt this level of comfort and peace that I so idolize and love? If God does wrong, he should be cursed. And therefore, God is not sovereign over many people's lives. Man is sovereign. And many today flat out reject the sovereignty of God, and they reject sovereign suffering because they have learned to love comfort more than God. The slightest disruptions to our daily routines can fill people with such anger and anxiety. Can they not? Just drive down the 270 during traffic every morning, right? And you're faced with that temptation. But here's the wonderful thing. Through the Word and through the power of the Holy Spirit, the believer has this immovable, unshakable root in God. A heart that remains loyal to God even in the fiercest storm. Job trusted God. Praise God, he did. He never lost his faith. Initially, he bows down in worship. When the suffering lingers, he tottered a bit, he wavered, but he never abandoned God. And in the end, he was a godlier man than he was before his painful sufferings. C.S. Lewis once said, "He who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God only." And beloved, I think that's why God does what he does. God is just trying to strip away this white knuckle grip on things, not necessarily bad things. Could be bad sin, could be an encumbrance, not necessarily a sinful thing in and of itself, but God is seeking to remove this white knuckle grip on that which stands in the way of truly enjoying him. And so at times in his wisdom, he drops innocent suffering into our lives. And that becomes a crucible, a test to see, John, do you love me because of X, Y, and Z in your life? Is that why you're really following me? Is this why you're in the ministry? Is this why you're a pastor? Is this why you're a Christian? Is it because I just give you pleasant things and you love these things? Or is it, John, will you follow me? Will you be loyal to me? Because God is worthy of my trust. And if you find yourself in this unexpected season of suffering, I pray that you wouldn't run from God. No, beloved, run to him. And learn that secret hiding place that so many saints of old have found, that secret place where it's just you and God alone. And your heart is there broken, and yet you're praising God. Because you know, as Lewis said, I have everything I need in God. Job at the end says, Lord, Job 42, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. This is how we turn the enemy of pain, the enemy of suffering, into a friend. We keep our eyes riveted on our great and gracious and glorious God, and we never back down from that belief. We stay there. God, you're trustworthy because of who you are. You're trustworthy because of who you are. You are trustworthy because of who you are. I close with this quote by John MacArthur. He says, in the end, the lesson learned was that one may never know the specific reason for his suffering, but one must trust in our sovereign God. That is the real answer to suffering. Would you bow your heads?